Hello, my name is Jose Olivarez. I'm a poet, a writer, and educator. My book of poems, Citizen Illegal, was published in 2018 and won the Chicago Review of Books Poetry Prize. And I helped edit the anthology, The Breakbeat Poets, Volume 4, Latinx. And today I'm going to be giving a craft talk on the poetics of utopia. And I'm going to be using two texts that I think do an excellent job of writing speculative literature, writing futurist, Afrofuturist literature that keeps one foot grounded in the present day reality as well as reaches for a vision. And in so doing, teaches us about what might be possible through writing towards utopia. Right off the bat, I'm reminded of a quote from the Uruguayan writer, Eduardo Galeano, who says, they ask what good is, and I'm paraphrasing, they ask what good is walking towards utopia for, and it's good for just that, right? It's good for walking. It's good for taking steps forward towards our ideal living situations. So if we want to write about utopia, what do we need to know? First of all, I think one of the issues that writers struggle with when they're trying to write towards a utopic vision is the first thing they do is they think about a perfect world. And they reach for that world in a way that is disconnected from our imperfect reality. So for example, a world where there's chocolate fountains on every block, a world where there's dessert provided every night is not necessarily the best use of our visioning. Though I love sweets, though I love dessert, it's unconnected from our real world struggles, right? And in so doing it floats out in space as in like a fairy tale world that is maybe a little bit too cartoonish. So the first thing that I would think about is, and it might seem a little bit contrarian, but not to think about utopia, but to think about our real world situations. And each writer has a different context, right? And we'll see in both of these poems that the position of the writers are different. Janelle Pineda is writing in another life from the perspective of someone who is the descendant of people from El Salvador who survived civil war that was propagated by U.S. imperialism, amongst other things, right? Eve L. Ewing is writing Arrival Day from the perspective of someone who is a Black American in the United States, in the midst also of a lot of uprisings against police, right? We're not talking about a theoretical struggle against police. We're talking about an ongoing struggle, uprising against police. And so their positionality is different. And so the way they address those issues and the way they kind of show their position in their poems is going to be different, right? Everyone's idea of utopia is going to be different because each of us kind of have our own concerns that ground us, that we're struggling against every day. So I want to begin first by reading you In Another Life by Janelle Pineda. So this is Janelle's poem, In Another Life. And I'll read both of the poems because they are poems and relatively short, so it won't take up too much time. In Another Life by Janelle Pineda. The war never happened, but somehow you and I still exist. Like obsidian, we know only the memory of lava and not the explosion that created us. Forget the gunned down church, the burning flesh, the cabbage soup. There is no bus. There is no border. There are only sweet cornfields and mango skins. The turquoise house and clotheslines, a heaping plate of pasteles encurtido waiting to be disappeared into our bellies. In this life, our people are not things of silences, but whole worlds bursting into breath. Everywhere there are children, playing freely, clothed and clean. Mozote does not mean massacre, and flowers bloom in every place. Shoes are left behind. My name still means truth, this time in a language my mouth recognizes, in a language I know how to speak. My grandmother is still a storyteller, although I am not a poet. In this life, I do not have to be. This poem somehow still exists. It is told in my mother's voice, and she makes hurt dissolve like honey in hot water, manzanilla warming the throat. You and I do not find each other on another continent, grasping at each other's necks in search of home. We meet in a mercado, my arms overflowing with mamey and anonas, and together we wash them in river water. We watch sunset fall over a land we call our own and do not fear its taking. I bite into the fruit, mouth-sucking seed from substance, pulling its veins from between my teeth. Our laughter echoes from inside the cave, one we are free to step outside of. We do not have to hide here. We do not have to hide anywhere. A torrogos flies past my face, and I do not fear its flapping. Cool. So that was In Another Life by Janelle Pineda. This is a poem that I really love. And so right off the bat, what do you notice, right? The title is In Another Life. So one of the things that I really admire about this poem is that the poet kind of gives away the project with the title. We know by the title In Another Life that we're going to get images writing about an alternative life than the one we are living. Now, we may not know exactly what that means, right? We may not know the direction. In Another Life could be, a love poem. And I mean, I think this also is a love poem, but it could be a different type of love poem. But pretty soon, the first line kind of makes clear the poem's intentions. The war never happened, but somehow you and I still exist, right? That's the first sentence. It's about 3/4 of the first line, and that first sentence does so much. The first words are the war never happened, and so right off the bat, we know that we're writing from a life where the war did happen. And the way, the second half of that sentence is, but somehow you and I still exist. And so we are also writing from a world where you and I exist, but we exist because of the war, right? And so right off the bat, the poem grounds you in, not just, in some ways it's misleading. The poem says in another life, but it actually begins in this life right here, right? It's beginning here and using here as a starting place to map out what an alternative utopic life might be able to offer. And that's important because, of course, we are here, right? We're not in utopia. So if we're going to start dreaming of utopia, we don't need to kind of turn away from the reality of what we're actually living in, our actual circumstances. Instead, we can turn towards those circumstances as a way of imagining an alternative universe, right? It's not disconnected, right? We dream of Medicare for all because too many of us are without health insurance. Too many of our family members are struggling to pay health bills, right? So I love that kind of movement in the poem. Like obsidian, We know only the memory of lava and not the explosion that created us. Just beautiful language. Forget the gunned down church, the burning flesh, the cabbage soup. Again, all of these lines, even though it says forget these things, are also telling us that they exist, right? If there weren't any gunned down churches, we wouldn't have to forget them in the first place. So even though it's being done in the negative sense, saying, in another life, there are no gunned down churches, it reminds us that in this life, there are gunned down churches. There was burning flesh. There is cabbage soup. And we need that reminder in order to get to what happens a little bit later on, right? So now I'm looking at, the poem is written in couplets, and I'm looking at line 6. Actually, let's go back to line 5. Only sweet cornfields and mango skins, the turquoise house and clotheslines, a heaping plate of pasteles encurtido waiting to be disappeared into our bellies. Now this line again is useful because it uses the verb disappeared, right? Which we know in Latin America and in other parts of the world is a purposeful choice. It's not food that gets disappeared usually, right? It's people that get disappeared. I'm thinking here of Pinochet's regime in Chile that disappeared people. And so it's using that language of violence to talk about and move towards this image of, what is health, what is like a really delicious feast that we might share together, a heaping plate of pasteles encurtido. The next line says, in this life, our people are not things of silences, but whole worlds bursting into breath. So again, it's that establishment of what, through the negative, right, are not things of silence, that we also are reminded of what is true about this world that we find ourselves in, but whole worlds bursting into breath. And here are some of the most beautiful lines in the poem. Mozote does not mean massacre, and flowers bloom in every place shoes are left behind. Flowers bloom in every place shoes are left behind is just beautiful imagery. It takes this very mundane and yet powerfully grievous image of shoes being left behind, right? Which gets us to ask the question of why are shoes left behind? And we can imagine some bad circumstances that might lead for shoes leaving behind, right? People might leave shoes behind because they have to flee, very quickly, and so they don't get a chance to pack. Or they might leave shoes behind because they die, and so they, the dead don't carry their shoes. So that image of shoes left behind is already by itself, filled with grief. And this idea, this complicated idea of flowers blooming, which is, a rebirth, but could also be like a memorialization, right? We bring flowers to the dead. So it's just a very beautiful, powerful image to me. And then the poet moves into her own history, right? In this other life, she is not a poet because she doesn't have to be. And that's a really that's a powerful claim to make, right? To say, in part, these circumstances are what created my voice as a poet. And if in another life, maybe we wouldn't have to speak. It says something about the poet's belief in what poetry is and can be. And then more beautiful imagery. This poem somehow still exists. It is told in my mother's voice, and she makes hurt dissolve like honey in hot water, manzanilla warming the throat. I mean, that's just gorgeous, right? She makes hurt dissolve like honey in hot water, manzanilla warming the throat. and then the speaker and the audience, right? I also love the you, excuse me, I love the you and I that kind of repeats throughout the poem, as opposed to a we, which might be too broad. It's you and I, right? Speaking directly to this other person who is, part of diaspora, who has been created by this moment of violence. You and I do not find each other on another continent. Again, it's placing us in Central America, right? So we don't meet somewhere else. We meet right here, right? So the poem is also telling us where it's being written from, right? This is a poem being written from El Salvador to an alternative universe where people do not have to flee El Salvador. It is not written by, Janelle in Los Angeles, looking back in one way, right? It's written from El Salvador by a Salvadoran writer looking at an alternative El Salvador. So this poem is really beautiful. It has, it paints this picture of what another life is possible, and also reminds us that it's not impractical, right? Utopia is not impractical. Writing towards the future is not impractical. It's very practical, the demands that we ask for, the things that we're looking at, right? All we're asking for is a chance to meet each other here, as opposed to in a migration camp somewhere, right? As opposed to in another country, in a different language. All we're asking for is a chance to be able to live our lives where we're currently at in a healthy way. So this poem is beautiful. Definitely recommend you check it out. And now I'll read you Arrival Day by Eve Ewing. And Arrival Day, similar to Janelle's poem In Another Life, kind of begins by telling us, what it's going to do, right? The poem is straightforward in its framing, but the language is going to give us all sorts of wonder and surprises. So I'll point some of that out to you. So this is Arrival Day by Eve Ewing, and it starts with the quote by Assata Shakur. Black revolutionaries do not drop from the moon. We are created by our conditions. So that quote right away tells you that the poem is going to be thinking about Black revolutionaries. And you'll see that, the poet basically takes this premise, Black revolutionaries do not drop from the moon, which is what Assata Shakur says, and says basically, but what if they did drop from the moon? What might that world look like? Arrival Day by Eve Ewing. Black revolutionaries do not drop from the moon. We are created by our conditions. And, just real quick pause. That quote basically echoes what I'm telling you in this craft talk, right? Utopic texts do not drop from the moon. They are created from our conditions. They are created by our conditions. All right, now for the third time, let me try to read this poem. Arrival Day by Eve Ewing. Black revolutionaries do not drop from the moon. We are created by our conditions. Assata Shakur. It happened under cover of night or early morning, depending on who you ask. The hour when the press stops running, when the baker arrives and unlocks the door. The cables came down, silent and charcoal, matte and slithering. They hit the earth and coiled at the foot of a tree, on a bus stop bench, atop a mound of cigarette butts in front of the dialysis center. Later, when the NASA boys looked for footage of the arrival, surely some security camera in some parking lot, surely some security camera in some parking lot somewhere in America. That hour was all blank, everywhere, all blank, like as if each of them had a magnet for a beating heart, their veins murmuring, clear it away, until the tape was empty. In the years before, when hateful men warned of the coming, crushed aluminum cans in their hands while their friends threw darts or in rowboats tying flies, they spoke only of darkness. Their eyes will be dirt, the men said, and they will cover the windows with tar in places where we talk to God. They will seize our daughters who will return to us in rags, holding mud babies and asking for a room to sleep. The hateful men and their wives wore reading glasses and drank cinnamon tea on the days when they wrote letters to each other about how the coming people would steal, how they loved the sound of grinding teeth in place of real music, how the girl ones were greedy and lustful and felt no pain but made endless noise, and how small ones could trick you, looking like children, but their skin was mercury, and they could not be shot dead, so do not fall for it. They wrote their letters on glass and plastic and metal. They said they are coming and they will paint everything black. So they had no words for the moon people when they did come, and the moon people could not be captured. Camera lenses looking on them turned to salt and cast white trails across the eyelids of the looker. And the moon people were dressed in every color. They wore saffron yellow and cool cigarette green and Georgia clay red, and they wore violet, and they were loud as their hands worked hammering the iron of the jail cell doors into lovely rock curls and bicycle chains, smashing the fare boxes at the train stations into window chimes, and bowing low to the passengers as they entered, some sashaying through the turnstile, some dropping it low as they went underneath. They sang. The moon people had been listening all this time, and they knew all about Sam Cooke and Aretha Franklin and Mahalia Jackson and Marvin Gaye and Missy Elliott, and they sang while they smashed a bottle on the squad cars, a Hennessy bottle or a Coke or a pressed Cal juice, whatever was near enough to say, this here is christened a new thing. And they drove them down my street and your street and your street, the tires painted to look like vinyl 45s, and the children tied yarn and ribbons to the window shield wipers. And the moon people turned them on high so that as they drove, the colors waved into the sunlight, which was now streaming so clearly onto the porch where I sat rubbing the rusting chain of the swing and thinking of grass when the boy down the street, who in smaller days I walked to school when his mother worked early, who loved lime popsicles the best, who danced his way from his own porch to the basketball court in the afternoon, who the police had recently declared a man, stopping him mid-two-step to ask questions he could not answer because the query beneath them was, why are you alive? And none of us can say. The boy, he came to me and walked up the steps where the paint is peeling and knelt at my side, and I did not look him in the eye. Instead, I watched a firefly, the first of the summer, land on his left shoulder, and I thought, here are two glowing ones. But he did not notice, only held my hand and told me we are free now, and I could not believe I had lived to see it. The promised light descended to us at last. Listen, this poem is beautiful. It's an incredible poem, one of my favorite poems. And again, another beautiful illustration of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about writing utopia, not as a way of disconnecting from the present, but as a way of further bringing attention to what is possible even within our own imperfect world, right? And in Eve's poem, the beginning kind of foreshadows it. It happened under the cover of night. And it says that when they looked for footage of the arrival, surely some security camera in some parking lot somewhere in America, that hour was all blank, right? So kind of telling us that, part of that, because of scrutinization and surveillance, that part of what is needed from these revolutionaries is a need to be able to wipe away that security footage, right? I love so much of this poem, in part because it's so cinematographic. I hope that's a word. It's like very visual. You can kind of see each scene. It kind of plays like a short film. So I love all of that. And then to me, I mean, the scene at the train station is really beautiful. It says they wore saffron yellow and cool cigarette green and Georgia clay red, and they wore violet. Like, those colors are so specific and pop so much that it always makes me smile when I read those. And then what happened, what they do, right? They hammer the iron of the jail cell doors into lovely rock curls and bicycle chains. They smash the fare boxes and then dance through. Again, these images don't come from nowhere, right? They come from real struggles to make public transportation, to make it affordable, to make it free. They come from struggles to dismantle the prison industrial complex, to abolish the police, to abolish prisons. So I love all of those images. And then, to me, maybe the most clear moment in the poem in terms of the connection from the present to this imagined future is the moment with the boy at the end of the poem, the last stanza. Onto the porch where I sat rubbing the rusting chain of the swing and thinking of grass, when the boy down the street who in smaller days I walked to school, right? This boy who the police had recently declared a man, stopping him mid two-step to ask a question he could not answer because the query beneath them was, why are you alive? And none of us can say. This is not a moment disconnected from reality. This is a moment, that we have seen play out again and again with disastrous consequences. And so for the boy down the street to kind of be in the poem, for the narrator, the speaker, to say, here are two glowing ones, right, watching a firefly, with the Black revolutionaries coming down from the moon, and being created by circumstances, right? It's just a beautiful image and a beautiful way to end the poem. The promised light descended to us at last, right? And that language, again, could make you think that this is hypothetical, but the promised light is not necessarily an endpoint in this poem, right? It is, surely I imagine that after we abolish the police and after we get health care for everybody and after we make public transportation affordable or free, that there will be more struggles that we will have to take up, right? And so what we need is not, we need not to think about utopia necessarily as an endpoint, but as, an alternative path, another way that we can be moving through the world, a reminder that we don't need to accept the present, the current, as the only possibilities. So these poems do that for me, and they're just beautiful pieces of literature. I really love a lot of the images in both of the poems. I think the language is strong. The music in both is really lovely. I can hear the rhythms. And so I think, in conclusion, if you are someone who is trying to write either about present realities and is struggling to do it in a way that doesn't just recreate the violences, right, that we see all too often, or if you are someone who is trying to maybe turn away from the violences towards this utopic future that is trying to take on the work of imagining other possibilities, but you're finding that your poems, your works are maybe just floating, right? They don't seem grounded. That these two poems are examples of how you can ground your work in the current realities, in our current struggles, right? That to turn towards utopia is not to turn away from our present struggles. It's actually to turn towards our present struggles and remember to reimagine them. I think these two poems, Eve Ewing's Arrival Day and Janelle Pineda's In Another Life, are really great examples of how you can do that in your work. I just want to say thank you for watching. And once again, my name is Jose Olivarez, and I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you.